Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, December 7th. And we begin tonight with yet another key interest rate hike by the Bank of Canada. But officials believe that after this, it may hit the pause button for a while. The central bank issued a rate hike of half a percentage point. This brings its trend-setting rate to 4.25%. It is the highest it's been since 2008. This with the accompanying news release suggesting that the central bank is aware of the growing evidence that higher interest rates are restraining demand in the economy. Today's rate hike marks the seventh consecutive hike since March in the wake of decades-high inflation. Meanwhile, the controversy over provincial sovereignty acts continue in Western Canada. First Nations chiefs in Alberta and Saskatchewan are calling for their provinces to toss proposed legislation, which they say is inherently undemocratic, unconstitutional, and infringes on Indigenous rights. The chiefs are putting forward an emergency resolution at the Assembly of First Nations Special Assembly. This will be to reject the sovereignty bills that are before both provincial legislatures. Chief Tony Alexis says there has been no consultation or dialogue with First Nations around the Alberta bill. In an attempt to dislodge a political impasse in Haiti, Canada is sending one of its top diplomats to help work things out. Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, is set to start an in-person push for negotiations in Port-au-Prince. Haiti is facing a series of crises as armed gangs block access to fuel and essentials. This is leading to water and power outages that are worsening an existing outbreak of cholera. Well, as hospitals continue to battle a surge in respiratory illnesses across the country, doctors say influenza spread is starting to hit older adults. Recent data from the Public Health Agency of Canada shows that children under 5 still made up the highest number of hospitalized flu patients. But surveillance levels indicate that the rate of seniors being admitted for flu isn't far behind. Infectious disease specialist Dr. Isaac Bogosh in Toronto says there is a perfect storm of monster flu season without enough people getting the flu shot. This comes as hospitals nationwide are overstretched dealing with COVID-19 and RSV. All right, moving to Saskatchewan now, where the auditor says that the province is facing a shortage of healthcare workers over the next 5 years. And Tara Clement is warning that it could lead to more hospital closures and emergency room shutdowns. The auditor says in her report that the Saskatchewan Party government's current plan to recruit workers is inadequate for the 2,000 spots that need to be filled by 2027. She says the government needs to figure out why healthcare staff are leaving and what it can do to keep them in the province, especially in rural areas. Health Minister Paul Merriman says he accepts the auditor's recommendations. Well, health system problems can also be seen on the East Coast, where many in Nova Scotia are struggling to connect with a doctor in any way, including virtually. Virtual medicine offered a novel way for patients to see doctors early in the COVID-19 pandemic when medical facilities were locked down to all but emergencies. Nova Scotia Health says about 150 to 200 virtual visits are available per weekday to the 120,000 people without a family doctor. The province says it is trying to recruit more providers. All right, moving to public anger in Winnipeg, which is leading police to add some background on their decision not to search a landfill for human remains. Police say the passage of time, environmental conditions, and other factors at the Prairie Green landfill would make it very unlikely that the remains of 2 Indigenous women could be found. Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron are believed to have been the victims of a serial killer. Inspector Cam McKidd says police have no starting point to search the 1.6-hectare site. This is where trash is compacted with heavy mud at a depth of about 12 meters. Air Canada says it needs to focus on rebuilding its main hubs in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, so it is suspending some flights in the prairies. The airline says it is suspending direct flights between Calgary and Saskatoon and between Calgary and Regina starting in mid-January. Passengers will now have to catch a connecting flight through Vancouver, which will be more than triple the time it takes to reach Calgary with a direct flight. Ending the segment on a high note for Canada's domestic musical instrument industry. A guitar company in Kamloops, BC has triumphed over industry heavyweights like Yamaha and Taylor to have its River Pacific model named Acoustic Guitar of the Year. Mike Miltimore, the owner of River Song Guitars, says it is the first time that a Canadian company has won the award, which is given by the Musical Merchandise Review magazine. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. On the heels of the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, advocates want to continue the conversation in hopes of ending the issue in Canada. Today is also day 13 of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, an annual international campaign which encourages people to help prevent and end all forms of gender-based violence. The campaign is set to end on December 10th, Human Rights Day. This month, Women and Gender Equality Canada launched its own national campaign theme, It's Not Just, which highlights both the issue of gender-based violence and how society can dismiss and minimize behavior or beliefs associated with it. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this and how Canadians can help end gender-based violence is Dr. Erin Whitmore, Executive Director at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. Dr. Whitmore, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So, what is the latest data we have on the current state of gender-based violence in Canada?
We know that gender-based violence continues to be a significant public health and human rights crisis in Canada. For example, we know 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical and sexual violence, and those numbers hold true in Canada. We certainly saw during the pandemic that rates of gender-based violence increased, and also the severity of that violence increased. And we know that there is always an increasing demand for access to services to support those who have experienced violence. I think, though, that the numbers only give us part of the picture, and that we really want to also recognize the significant impacts that gender-based violence holds for those who do experience these types of violence, these forms of violence.
On that note, can you tell us a little bit more about these significant impacts due to gender-based violence?
Sure. Well, gender-based violence can take many different forms. Often we hear about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, about sexual assault, but we also want to be aware of emotional or psychological abuse, financial abuse, technology, facilitated abuse. And I think it's important to remember that the impacts of that violence don't necessarily end when the violence itself stops, that often survivors of violence face many challenges in accessing services. There can be challenges in terms of mental health, in terms of their ability to continue to go to school or go to work, impacts in terms of their relationships. And violence continues to really limit and interrupt, the hopes and dreams that women and others who experience violence hold for themselves.
And it's so important to highlight, as you said, that gender-based violence comes in so many forms, not necessarily very obvious forms. Now, in terms of Canada's national theme, it's not just. Now, that's actually shedding light on how society can sometimes dismiss or minimize such gender-based violence, which can sometimes be in subtle ways. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how this happens?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that, one of the challenges, of course, is that gender-based violence often can be seen as something that happens between two individuals and is a private matter that, doesn't need to be discussed more broadly. But of course, we know that we have to have a conversation and talk about this violence if we want to make a difference. I think that also, it can be really challenging to talk about these experiences if you yourself are experiencing violence. Often it can be difficult to know who to talk to. It may be difficult to find somewhere to turn to that you feel is a safe place. Often someone who is using violence also tries to isolate someone, to silence them, and to make it really difficult to make that violence visible. So all of those can contribute to us not fully recognizing the extent of this problem. That being said, there is a lot of evidence that shows the extent of the problem of gender-based violence, and we really need to stop pretending that this isn't as big an issue as it is, and that it really requires action on the part of all Canadians if we really want to make a difference.
Some very important points to consider, especially leading up to Human Rights Day. As we know, women's rights are human rights. Dr. Whitmore, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. And up next, we're going to take a look at the UN Biodiversity meeting happening in Montreal. We'll be speaking with Jay Ritchlin, the David Suzuki Foundation's Nature Director. He's going to help to unpack what is happening at the COP15 summit and what to expect from the 2-week conference. After that, of course, we'll have major headlines from around the world. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back. Work is underway in Montreal today and for the next 2 weeks on ways to save the planet. This comes as the COP15 Global Biodiversity Conference looks to secure a plan to protect 30% of the Earth's land and water. Negotiators from nearly 200 countries are being asked to hammer out an agreement to begin to restore damaged ecosystems and halt further losses by 2030. Nature itself can help to prevent devastating losses due to climate change. It can absorb carbon dioxide that is contributing to global warming and reduce the effects of extreme weather. Erin of the Nature Conservancy of Canada says the need for the 30% target is well supported by 50 years of scientific research. Well, with us now to discuss the conference and its goals is Mr. Jay Ritchlin, Nature Director and Director General for Western Canada at the David Suzuki Foundation. Mr. Ritchlin, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So as we said, the goal of this conference is to ratify an agreement to preserve 30% of the world's land and water. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that would look like?
Sure. Well, I really want to start out by emphasizing that the global biodiversity framework is much more than that. The protection of 30% of ocean and terrestrial land ecosystems is incredibly important, but it's a baseline from which we need to work to restore other ecosystems and to manage the way humans act in the areas that aren't protected as well. And those are really big parts of this conference. What it would look like is areas that are highly protected from industrial extraction. So no, industrial forestry or mining or really destructive fisheries in those areas. They would allow traditional uses for Indigenous people in many cases, and that's one of the big things being worked on now. And then we would have a system of ecosystem-based management outside the protected areas that meant that we weren't just running down our nature bank account, if you will, outside the protected areas and pretending that we were doing okay just by having 30% protected. That won't be enough. It's incredibly important, but it won't be enough by itself.
Sounds like a lot of initiatives to consider here. Now, we know the G7 has already agreed to this 30% target. So how likely are we to see a global consensus at this conference?
I think we have a good chance. I think the wealthy nations need to agree to support the developing world or the global south, however you want to term it, because their ability to get the things that they need to survive will potentially be limited by putting areas under protection. And they deserve to have some financial support to make that possible for their societies during a transition period to a different kind of economy that's not completely based on heavy extraction and consumption.
You also mentioned the Nature Conservancy of Canada says this 30% target is backed by 50 years of science. Can you tell us a little bit more about the scientific proof behind this 30% target?
Well, the science definitely shows that where we have areas with limited human industrial scale intervention, those areas provide clean air, clean water, food resources, pollination resources. I mean, we are all nature. We need nature to survive. So creating some spaces where the natural world is not completely under threat allows it to adapt to climate change, allows it to continue to have healthy areas where populations can grow and thrive, And humans then can still make their living and meet their needs by acting well in the other areas outside of that.
All right, Mr. Ritchlin, a little over a minute left here, but in recent news, we know the PM has announced $800 million to fund indigenous-led conservation projects across the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we know so far about this initiative?
I think it's an incredible announcement. It's new to many of us today. We have confirmed that the 800 million is new money from the federal government. They're looking for matching funds from other parts of civil society and from private sector. But the nations are going to have a lot of say in how this looks going forward. So I think a lot of the details are going to come from the indigenous communities themselves. But I can say that we think this is a very positive sign.
And is there anything that you're keeping your eyes on as this conference continues?
Yeah, absolutely. The way we work outside that 30% protected area is imperative to get that right. We need halting nature loss and reversing it to be in the commitments, and we need to deal with things like plastics, pesticides, and pollution, as well as just cutting down nature. And we've got to remember that the ocean is also part of the natural world. So land and ocean need the protection.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Mr. Ritchlin, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. After the break, we're going to take a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. German police detained 25 people after countrywide raids against suspected extremists. The Democrats win a closely watched Senate race in Georgia, and China continues to ease some of its COVID-19 restrictions. These stories and more coming up next after a short break. Stay tuned. Thousands of police officers across Germany carried out raids against suspected far-right extremists who allegedly sought to overthrow the government. Officials say 25 people were detained. Germany's justice minister described the raids as anti-terrorism operations. She added that the suspects may have planned an armed attack on institutions of the state. The suspects were linked to the so-called Reich Citizens Movement, whose adherents reject Germany's post-war constitution and have called for bringing down the government. Turning to a bombing in Indonesia, where police say a militant and convicted bomb maker who was released from prison last year blew himself up at a police station. The attack on the main island of Java killed an officer and wounded 11 people. The bomber entered the police station with a motorcycle and detonated one of 2 bombs, which he was carrying as police were lining up for a morning assembly. The national police chief says the attacker was still on police red lists after being freed from prison. South of our border, last night's election win in Georgia means Democrats in the U.S. Senate no longer need to rely on the vice president to cast tie-breaking votes. Senator Raphael Warnock's runoff victory gives Democrats a 51-49 Senate majority. Republican challenger and football legend Herschel Walker conceded defeat. He was unable to overcome a host of damaging allegations. Christian Walker blasted his father on social media, writing, quote, "Don't beat women, hold guns to people's heads, fund abortions, and then pretend you're pro-life, and then maybe you can win a Senate seat." All right, switching gears to big moves being made in China as the country rolls back some of its rules on isolating people with COVID-19. This while also dropping virus test requirements for some public places. It is a dramatic change to a strategy that confined millions of people to their homes and sparked protests. Beijing's zero-COVID strategy has disrupted manufacturing and global trade. China is the last major country still trying to stamp out transmission of the virus, while many nations have moved to trying to live with it. Officials in Spain say 2 commuter trains were involved in a morning rush hour crash. The trains were carrying about 800 people, and over 150 are reported to be injured. The collision occurred on a train line north of Barcelona. One train was apparently stopped when another ran into it from behind. A New Zealand court has temporarily taken away medical custody of a baby from his parents. This comes after they refused blood transfusions for him unless the blood comes from donors who are unvaccinated against COVID-19. Today's ruling in favor of health authorities places the 4-month-old boy into the guardianship of authorities. This will be until after he undergoes an urgently needed heart operation and recovers. The parents remain in charge of decisions about their boy that don't relate to the operation. All right, well, back in the U.S., Donald Trump's company has been convicted of tax fraud. This for a scheme by top executives to dodge paying taxes on lavish perks such as Manhattan apartments and luxury cars. A jury found 2 corporate entities at the Trump Organization guilty on all 17 counts. And as punishment, the Trump Organization could be fined up to $1.6 million. Company lawyers plan to appeal. Tech giant Microsoft says it struck a deal to make the hit video game Call of Duty available on Nintendo for 10 years. This will happen once its $69 billion purchase of game maker Activision Blizzard goes through. The announcement is being seen as an attempt to fend off concerns from rival Sony with antitrust watchdogs. Microsoft's president says the same deal is available to Sony. Activity at the World Cup takes a day off today in Qatar as the 8 remaining teams get set to play in the quarterfinals. The next World Cup will be the biggest ever as world soccer body FIFA takes the leap from a 32-team field to 48 teams in 2026. It means more of soccer's so-called little teams will be given a chance to win the World Cup. Now that's some great news for everyone who was entertained by Saudi Arabia's upset of Argentina and Morocco kicking out Spain. Time magazine has named Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky its Person of the Year. It awarded him the accolade for proving that courage can be just as contagious as fear. He was named alongside the spirit of Ukraine. Time magazine's editor-in-chief said Wednesday that the choice was the most clear-cut in memory. The magazine also highlighted people set to embody the spirit of Ukraine. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.